Hello, my name's Sue Povell. I'm an oral storyteller based in Wirral in England. Today I'm going to tell you a story called The Cowtail Switch, which is from West Africa. Today is the anniversary of the first lockdown in the UK to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Many people have lost loved ones during the lockdown and perhaps haven't been able to grieve properly. So I dedicate this story to my Auntie Jill, my cousin Julie, and all of you. I also dedicate this story to the NHS, who've kept going under enormous pressure, who've saved many lives and helped many others. I thank you and everybody else working on the front line that's kept us going and kept us safe. Ogalusu was a hunter who was married to Sanyu, and between them they had 6 fine boys. And Sanyu, she was carrying their 7th child, which they also hoped would be a son. Now Ogalusu and Sanyu, they lived in a village on the edge of a forest, a vast forest that stretched as far as the eye could see, and sent tendrils up valleys in the hillsides. Between the forest and the village was a shallow river, and around the village were fields where the villagers grew their crops and where they tended their cattle. You might wonder, why does a village with cattle need hunters? But the truth is, in a warm climate with no refrigeration, to kill a cow is a big deal, and it was only done in celebrations where everybody in the village could join in with eating the meat. So if the villagers wanted meat, they would go into the forest and hunt monkeys and birds. So, one morning, when the rising sun was pushing mauve and pink and orange and apricot and yellow into a pale blue sky, Ogalusu picked up his spear and his bow and his arrows, and he took the path that wound through the village, skirted the plantain trees, forded the narrow river, and went up to the edge of the forest. And there he stepped inside. Now Sanyu and the boys, they did what they always did. They went out and they tended the crops in the fields and they looked after the cattle. But that evening when they came home and Sanyu started to prepare a meal, they all looked forward to the tasty treat they knew their father would be bringing them. But Ogalusu didn't come home. He didn't come home that day, or the day after, or the day after that. And the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months, and he did not return. Slowly Sanyu and the boys, they let his memory drift to the backs of their minds and to the depths of their hearts, where it was less painful. And they concentrated on the birth of Sanyu's 7th child. The day came, and Sanyu was delivered of another little boy, who she named Puli, as they'd agreed. Puli was a delight from the moment he arrived on this earth. He smiled almost straight away. He laughed and he chortled and he gurgled. The family and the whole village delighted to watch him grow. to pull himself standing, to take his first crawling steps, to take his first walking steps, to speaking his first words. You will be surprised, as the whole village was, to find that his first words were, "Where is my father?" Sanyu felt like a wall of grief pushing itself up out of her stomach, gathering in her heart and up out of her mouth, where it emitted as a long wail. The boys stood with their heads bowed, ashamed that they had forgotten their father so quickly. The eldest boy said, "Mother, I will go to the forest tomorrow. I will go into the forest and I will find our father, and whatever state he's in, I will bring him home to you." Quickly the other boys agreed to go too. So the next morning, as the rising sun pushed mauve and pink and orange and apricot and yellow into a pale blue sky, the boys picked up their spears and their bows and their arrows, and they set off, taking the path that wound its way through the village, that skirted the plantain trees, that crossed the shallow river and went up to the forest. There they stood. They took a deep breath and they stepped inside. But as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they felt their skin glistening with moisture. They heard the birds clapping in the trees above and animals possibly miles away crashing through the undergrowth, and insects humming and buzzing and biting around them. But they did what their father had taught them. Calmly and silently they walked a hunting paths, this way and that way, this way and that, till eventually, down a little used path, they found some bones, all messed up where animals had disturbed them. But there among the bones were Ogalusu's spear and his bow and his arrows. And they knew that their father had died. The boys stood in a circle around their father's bones, and they keened their grief at his loss. Just as well, said the first son, "Look, I can put those bones back together." And he picked up Ogalusu's bones, all of them, right down to the smallest bone from his ear, and placed them in the right order in a clearing nearby. He clicked his fingers. The bones snapped back together. "Just as well," said the second son, "that I can put flesh on our father's bones." And he reached into a pouch at his waist and he pulled out the dried petals of a sacred flower, which he rubbed and scattered all over Ogalusu's skeleton. And there, as the boys watched, flesh grew over the bones, finally ending with a beautiful, dark but pallid skin. Just as well, said the third son, that I can put blood into our father's veins. And he pricked the end of his finger, and he squeezed out a drop of blood, which he placed on his father's lips. The blood was sucked into Ogalusu's body, and as the boys watched, his heart began to beat. Just as well, said the fourth son, that I can put breath into our father's lungs. And he blew gently into Ogalusu's mouth and his nose, and his chest began to rise and fall, and the pallor of death faded from Ogalusu's skin. Just as well, said the fifth son, that I can give our father movement. And he chafed Ogalusu's arms and his legs and rubbed Ogalusu's chest. And then he held Ogalusu's hands and guided him to sit. Ogalusu opened his eyes. He blinked and looked around him. Just as well, said the sixth son, I can give our father his voice. And he sang a sacred song. And as he sang, Ogalusu returned the song, and his voice was restored. Ogalusu blinked. He looked around him. He looked at his sons. What happened to me? He said. So the boys, they told him. They told him how he'd gone hunting and hadn't returned. How Sanyu had had his seventh son, Puli, and how Puli had wanted to know where his father was, so they'd come to find him. And they'd found his bones, but they'd restored him to life with their gifts. Ogalusu nodded. Take me home, he said. So the boys helped him to stand. They shared their clothing with their father. They picked up his spear and his bow and his arrows. And they set off, silently, calmly, slowly, down the hunting paths, down to the edge of the forest, where they sat while Ogalusu rested and his eyes adjusted to the light. Now Sanyu's been beside herself all day. Lost her husband in the forest now. Her sons had all gone, except for the youngest, of course, but 6 boys. Would they come home? Would they come home? So she watched and she watched and she watched, and eventually she saw a group emerge and rest on the edge of the forest. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Oh, 1, 2. Oh. Then after a while she watched them stand, and they took the path that went down to the ford across the shallow river. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And she watched them skirt the plantain trees, and she watched them take the path that wound its way through the village. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. She stood and she watched as the boys peeled back before her, and there in the middle was Ogalusu. She had no words. Mama! Mama! Sanyu looked down Puli. What? What is it? Who is that man? Asked the little boy. Well, Sanyu, she scooped her boy up and she placed him into Ogalusu's arms. This, son, this is your father. boy looked into his father's eyes, and the father looked into the eyes of his son, and there was a love there that was deep and everlasting. Well, everybody cheered. People ran from the fields. The news reached out to them. Ogalusu is back. He's been risen from the dead. So they planned a feast. And some went up into the fields and they chose a cow. They brought the cow down to the village and they slaughtered it. And as they were preparing the meat for the fire, Ogalusu asked if he might have the tail of that cow, which they gave him gladly. Ogalusu, he took that tail and he went down to the river and he washed it clean. Then he sat under the shade of the plantain trees, and with long strings of tiny beads of black and orange and yellow and white, he wrapped a cord around the shaft of the tail to make a handle. And then he combed out the hair on the tail. And then he plaited in feathers from the forest, cowrie shells traded from the coast, beads that Sanyu had given him. And when he'd finished, he'd made the most beautiful cow tail switch that anybody had ever seen. So the feast came. Everybody was laughing and talking and eating and drinking and telling Ogalusu's story 1,000 times over. But eventually the noise subsided and Ogalusu raised his hand. Silence fell. Ogalusu held up the cow-tail switch. "I have made this," he said, "for the son who did the most to bring me home." Well, with that, the 6 boys, they started fighting. "Well, it'd be me," said the eldest. "I put the bones back together." "Well, you need bones for a body." "Well, bones are no good without flesh," said the second. "Well, he'd still be lying in the path if it wasn't for me giving him blood and me giving him breath and me giving him movement and me giving him his voice to share his wisdom." Bicker, 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 bicker. Ogalusu raised his hand and the boys fell silent. "Yes, my sons," he said, "I would not be here without you. You found me and you gave me life once more. And for that I will always be grateful." But then he reached down and he pulled Puli onto his knee and he said, "But the son that did the most to bring me home is Puli, because he remembered me." And as we say in this village, no one is truly dead while those that love them, remember them, and carry them in their hearts. And with that, the village erupted, because they knew the truth of Ogalusu's words. And then the drumming began, and everybody danced and sang and ate and drank all through the night, till the rising sun pushed mauve and pink and orange and apricot and yellow into a pale blue sky. We remember you